Imagine you have something really important to say. Maybe it could save someone's life. Maybe it could close a big deal. Maybe it's a moment you never want to forget. You reach for something to write with. There is nothing. Not because you were careless, not because you forgot to pack a pen, but because in the world you were born into, writing was not something regular people were allowed to do. Only kings, priests, and the super wealthy ever got to put words on paper. Writing was not a skill you could just learn. It was a privilege, like a locked door, and the key cost more money than most people made in an entire year. Now think about the pen sitting on your desk or the stylus next to your phone. You probably picked it up without even thinking about it. Maybe you clicked it during a boring meeting. Maybe you wrote a grocery list and never looked at it again. You treated it like it was nothing special. But here is the truth. People lived their whole lives and died without ever holding one of those. Entire civilizations were born and fell apart, and regular people never once had the power to write down their own story. That changes today. I'm Ethan Cole of Everyday Origins. Today, we're digging into the weird, sometimes brutal, and surprisingly emotional history of the pen. This is the story of the object that once separated the powerful from everyone else. Let's go way back. Around 3000 BCE in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, a group of people called the Sumerians were pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets. They used a tool made from a reed. This writing system is called cuneiform, and it is one of the oldest writing systems ever found. Here's something most people do not know. Those clay tablets were not being used to write poems or personal stories. They were financial records, grain counts, lists of who owed what to whom. The very first written words in human history were basically receipts. But here's the really interesting part. The people doing all this writing were not kings or rulers. They were scribes. A scribe was a professional writer, someone trained from childhood specifically to write for people in power. Learning to write was so difficult and so exclusive that it took years of schooling that most families could never afford. A scribe in ancient Sumer could make a very good living just because almost nobody else could do what they did. The reed stylus itself was cheap. You could find reeds in the marshes. Anyone could physically hold one, but knowing what to do with it, that knowledge was worth a fortune. The pen was never the real barrier. The knowledge behind it was the wall keeping people out. Fast forward to ancient Egypt around 2400 BCE. The tools got a little better. Egyptian scribes started using thin reed brushes dipped in ink made from soot, water, and plant gum. They wrote on papyrus, which is a material made from flattened river reeds. Here's the wild part. Papyrus was so expensive and hard to make that writers would sometimes scrape their letters clean and reuse the same sheet multiple times. The writing surface itself was a luxury item. In Egypt, scribes had serious social power. They did not have to do physical labor. They did not have to join the army. They got out of certain taxes. One ancient Egyptian text from around 1200 BCE actually says this out loud. It says something like, "Be a scribe, your body will be sleek, your hand will be soft." Think about that. Writing was being openly advertised as a way to escape hard physical work. The pen was not just a writing tool, it was a way to move up in society. Now travel to ancient China around 300 BCE. There, writers used a horsehair brush and an ink stick. Calligraphy, which is the art of beautiful handwriting, became almost like a spiritual practice. The tools used for writing, which included the brush, ink, paper, and a special ink grinding stone, were considered luxury items. Educated people collected them the way modern billionaires collect art. A single good ink stick could cost what a peasant farmer earned in several months.
Jump to medieval Europe, roughly 500 to 1400 CE. The main writing tool was now the quill. This was a feather, usually pulled from the wing of a goose or swan, that was carefully cut and shaped into a point. Monks living in monasteries did most of the writing. Making just one decorated book could take years and cost as much as a small house. Regular people did not just lack pens, they had no reason to own one because nobody expected them to ever read or write at all. Literacy rates in medieval Europe, meaning the percentage of people who could read and write, were somewhere between 5 and 10%. You really cannot make this stuff up. Here is where things get pretty grim. The quill was the main writing tool in Europe for over 1,000 years, and it came with hidden problems nobody fully understood at the time. To keep a quill writing smoothly, scribes had to constantly reshape the tip using a small knife. The average quill only lasted a few hours before it split or wore down. Professional writers went through hundreds of quills every single year. But that was actually the easy part to deal with. The real danger was the ink. Medieval ink was made from something called iron gall, which included ingredients like oak tree growths, iron sulfate, and gum. This ink was highly acidic, meaning it was chemically harsh. Writers handled it every day, sometimes for 8 to 10 hours straight. Over time, this ink slowly ate through the very pages it was supposed to preserve. It permanently stained fingers and clothing. And many scholars who spent decades writing by candlelight in cold and damp rooms suffered serious damage to their joints and spines. Their eyesight got worse and worse. There was no concept of a job-related illness back then. These writers suffered quietly. They often blamed their pain on getting old or on some kind of spiritual weakness. The people who were preserving human knowledge for future generations were physically destroying their own bodies doing it, and the knowledge they were saving still belonged almost entirely to the rich and powerful. The suffering of scribes built the libraries of kings. Let that sink in. In 1827, a Romanian inventor named Petrache Poenaru did something remarkable. He filed a patent in France for a fountain pen with a replaceable ink cartridge made from a large swan quill. The French government officially approved his patent on May 25, 1827. Poenaru was a mathematician and a revolutionary thinker. He was frustrated by the constant stopping and starting required to dip a quill into an inkwell every few seconds. His design would allow ink to flow continuously, which was something writers had been dreaming about for centuries. His design actually worked. So what happened next? Almost nothing.
The manufacturing technology of the 1820s was not good enough to produce his design reliably in large quantities. The tiny internal parts required such precise measurements that craftsmen of the time simply could not make them consistently. Poenaru went back to Romania, where he spent the rest of his life as a teacher and education reformer. He died in 1875 at the age of 83. He was respected in his home country, but almost completely invisible to the wider world. He never made money from his invention. He never saw it produced at scale. And when people talk about who invented the fountain pen, almost nobody mentions his name. Later manufacturers took a refined version of his basic idea and made millions from it decades after he died. The patent was real. The date was real. The idea was his, and history still forgot him. If you are the kind of person who genuinely wants to know the real story behind the things you use every day, this channel was made for you. Take 2 seconds and hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of Everyday Origins. Now back to the story, because it is about to get even better. The real turning point came in 1884. A man named Waterman, who sold insurance in New York, filed a patent for a reliable fountain pen that would not leak. He had designed a clever 3-channel system that controlled how ink flowed.
The story goes that Waterman had been badly embarrassed when a leaking pen destroyed an important contract signing and cost him a major client. He spent 2 years obsessing over the problem of ink flow. What he created changed everything. Before Waterman's pen, writers were using steel-tipped dip pens, which had already replaced quills by the 1820s. But these dip pens still required a separate bottle of ink sitting on a desk. Writers could not work while moving around. They could not sign documents away from a desk. They were still connected to a stationary surface. Waterman's fountain pen cut that connection completely. By 1900, his company was making tens of thousands of pens per year. By the 1920s, fountain pens from multiple companies were selling for as little as $1. Earlier versions had been completely out of reach for working-class people. Now, almost anyone could afford one. Around this same time, women were entering the workforce in huge numbers. Clerical jobs, office administration, typing pools, all of these required writing tools. Companies started marketing pens directly to female buyers for the first time.
The pen had traveled from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer to the handbag of a working woman in Chicago. That is not just a business story. That is a social revolution packed inside a small brass tube. Here is something most people believe without ever questioning it. The ballpoint pen was invented because fountain pens were too messy. That is only halfway true, and the more important half is actually wrong. László Bíró, a journalist from Hungary, did patent the ballpoint pen in 1938, but his main reason for inventing it was not to avoid mess, it was speed. Bíró worked with newspapers. Newspaper ink dried almost instantly. Fountain pen ink did not. He needed ink that could dry as fast as he wrote. His brother Georgi, who was a chemist, came up with the thicker ink that made the rolling ball tip actually work. In countries like the UK and Australia, the word Bíró became a general name for any ballpoint pen. This erased the specific achievement of the Bíró brothers, especially the chemistry work, which was honestly the harder problem to crack. The design was smart, but the ink was the real breakthrough. In 2010, a massive earthquake hit the country of Haiti. In the chaos that followed, one of the most urgent problems aid organizations discovered was not just a lack of food or water, it was a lack of documentation. Birth records had been destroyed, property ownership papers were gone, identity documents had vanished. People could not prove who they were, who their children were, or what they owned. Writing, the simple physical act of recording who a person is, became a survival issue almost immediately. Aid organizations rushed to hand out pens and paper alongside medicine and bandages. Without written documentation, people could not access aid. They could not legally claim resources. They could not start rebuilding their lives. Here's what's striking about this. The same thing that made scribes powerful in ancient Sumer was still happening in Haiti in 2010. Control over written records meant control over reality itself.
The pen had not lost its power. People had just forgotten it still had any. Every time a civilization breaks down, writing becomes urgently important again. Almost like 5,000 years of history suddenly collapses into one desperate moment. Take a step back and really think about what this small object is. A pen is not just a tool for moving ink across a surface. It is the technology that human beings used to claim the right to be remembered. For thousands of years, that right belonged to only a tiny fraction of people. Kings decided what was worth recording. Scribes wrote only what they were told to write. Monks preserved only what the church approved.
Every ordinary person who ever lived a full life, who loved someone deeply, who suffered through hard times, who figured something important out, vanished from history because they never held the right tool at the right moment. Nobody wrote their story down, so it disappeared. Right now, you are carrying more writing power in your pocket than a medieval king had in his entire royal court. You can record your own story. You can correct false information about yourself. You can put your own name into history in ways that would have been impossible for 90% of every human being who ever lived before you. That cheap pen sitting on your desk is not nothing. It is the final chapter of a 5,000-year story about who gets to be heard. Use it like you actually know that. Thank you for watching today's episode of Everyday Origins. If you enjoyed it, please hit subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment below telling me what topic you would like to see next. Until then, everything has history.